Hello, Euroites. We are beginning a new topic today. This is our topic number 11, if I'm not mistaken. And we are entering into the changes that are happening as a result of World War I. And so World War I really is a watershed moment in European history, in world history really, because from there we start to see this change culturally that's been developing, leading through the 19th century. We had this definite Victorian concept of what was acceptable in terms of morality, in terms of how you dress. You're not showing any ankle. You're very composed at all times. Always very fastidious about your morality and how you act in society. And you're very controlled, right? But all of that is starting to change. European culture goes into a bit of a crisis mode, into what we call the Age of Anxiety. And it's aptly named because with the end of with World War I and the end of World War I, people really began to challenge these concepts that they had before the war and start to see something very different emerging into the 20th century. You can see that through some of these pictures here. My favorite, though, is the one by Salvador Dali there. This guy just ripping himself out of a globe. Can't tell if Salvador Dali was, huffing too much paint thinner there, or, if we took it into a real artistic analysis, maybe it was just that, he was trying to show the changes happening in the world and this concept of anxiety that is predominating culture. I don't know. Could be the paint thinner. Could be his, his artistic beauty. Either way, cool picture. But that's bringing us into these changes that we're seeing happening after the war. Now, much of the pre-war mentality, 19th century pre-war mentality. Remember that war was very romanticized at this time, and so civilization itself, I would say, was romanticized too, because people believed that civilization was always progressing. Things were always getting better. Every new invention, every time period, every new cultural types of changes that came, they were always, making humans move from their troglodytic past, from their caveman up, beginnings at the beginning of world history into something much greater and more civilized that we start to see in the 20th century. Well, that changes. That changes with the trenches in World War I. That changes with the death and destruction of at least 10 to 13 million people, a third of which were civilian. That all changes because of the unimaginable carnage of World War I. Good example of that is from this political cartoon from a German magazine called Simplicissimus. It was the satirical magazine of the 1920s in Germany. And in 1920, they gave us this political cartoon called The War as I Saw It. And so, obviously, the war as it's being seen by this artist is, this brute of war, this incredibly disgusting and destructive, morphiditic-looking character is representing war. The industry being behind him, all of this industry that was thought to bring progress before is now only bringing mass burials, mass death. And you notice that the bodies that are being thrown into this pit are not just males, but also females, because the war will touch civilian lives as well. So it's not only in terms of physical carnage, but emotional, traumatic cultural carnage as well. But then the war will have, dramatic effects upon humans as well. Those that suffered through the turmoil of the war, fought in the trenches, now they're coming home and they're starting to feel the effects of that in what's called shell shock. And you can see that through this patient here, this man who is suffering from shell shock. It has these uncontrollable physical jerks that happen, and it's both a mental and emotional trauma that's brought on from the effects of war. So for instance, if you sustained a bombardment like at the Somme, where you were in a trench in a dugout, underground, being bombarded by shells for a week straight, it put you in an incredibly stressful situation. And so anytime you hear a loud noise after that point, anytime you hear like a book falling to the floor, you start to feel like you have to hide, like you have to run for cover, like you have this uncontrollable sensation within you to get away from the war. And so that's the kind of thing we see happening after World War I, to not only individuals, but many people starting to feel as if society itself had become shell-shocked. We have somewhat of a shell-shocked society in this, what we call a post-war disillusionment. So a good example of that we can see from a guy named Paul Valéry. He was a French poet, and he wrote the following regarding this age of anxiety that he sees and all of this disillusionment. By the way, if you don't know what disillusionment means, disillusionment, just for clarification, it means that, all of your idealism from the past, all of your ideas about, how perfect humanity was and how civilization was a good thing and industry was a good thing, all of that has been altered. All of that has been shaken. That assurance that you once had has been blown to pieces by the shells of World War I. All right? And so here we get a quote from Paul Valéry saying, "The storm has died away, and still we are restless, uneasy, as if the storm were about to break. Almost all the affairs of men remain in a terrible uncertainty. We think of what has disappeared, and we are almost destroyed by what has been destroyed. We do not know what will be born, and we fear the future, not without reason. Doubt and disorder are in us and with us. There is no thinking man, however shrewd or learned he may be, who can hope to dominate this anxiety, to escape from this impression of darkness." Ooh. So talk about, somber, definitely. His assurance in the world, his assurance in humanity and Christianity has been shaken to the core. And so a lot of it, just has to do with the war and the changes that it brought on society. And so that's bringing about what we call a modernist sensibility. We start to see this through things like literature and poetry and art. You can see that through the art here by Salvador Dali, which we discussed. You can also see it through literature, through what was known as the Lost Generation. These were primarily American authors to begin with. But a lot of what were called American expatriate authors, meaning that they, guys like F. Scott Fitzgerald and especially like Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway, fought in the war in an Italian ambulatory corps. He was wounded in battle, and then he decided to leave America and become an expatriate, meaning that he went somewhere else. In this case, he went to Europe, toured around for a long time, lived in Paris for a while, wrote a lot of dark, somber books as well about alcoholism and the effects of war. And so the Lost Generation refers to the literature and poets like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, but also refers to the lost generation of men, those millions of men, for instance, the over 1 million British soldiers that died, the 1.5 million British French soldiers that died, and the about 2 million German soldiers that died as the result of the war as well, including all of the numbers from other countries too. But those three main countries put out the most authors at this time that went along with what was called the Lost Generation, such as Erich Maria Remarque, who wrote All Quiet on the Western Front. We also have existentialism. So existentialism is this mentality where it was a new philosophical trend that happened in the early 20th century, especially after World War I, in which they believed that humans simply exist. There's no more conceptions of right or wrong. There's no heaven. There's no hell. There's no Christian moral faith. There's no God who's directing this process. All there is you, and you're 15 minutes on stage, and then you die, and it's over. That's it. That's all there is to life. And so existentialism, it's really a sad belief that there's nothing that you can do to impact the world. It's just you're there and you're done. And it's not, really not very exciting, honestly, not a very positive outlook. And then we have nihilism, which is frankly worse. Nihilism is this belief that all values are baseless and that nothing can be known or communicated. So essentially, humans cannot communicate with each other on any kind of level except a base level. They are not able to have deeper, meaningful relationships. There's no such thing as love. There's no such thing as God. It's this extreme pessimism. Now, if you look, it sounds awful, but if you look at the way the world had operated during those 4 years of traumatic war, you can maybe see where they're coming from. And so this is leading us into what's known as the Epoch of Confusion and the Age of Anxiety. This time period in European history where things are frankly just getting weird, where things are just, too much to handle. Humans are not enjoying what they're seeing anymore. All right, and so part of that goes along with views of the mind. The mind is definitely going to be viewed in different terms at this time, and it has to do with the revolutions in thought that we see. It's leading us through this progression of the revolutions of thought. If we take a look at some of the things we've seen happen throughout history, we have revolutions on how humans perceived the universe. And so some of the authors that changed our perception of our thoughts about the universe, we have Nicolaus Copernicus, who, of course, wrote On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres in 1543, effectively starting the scientific revolution. Then we had guys like Kepler and Galileo and, well, Newton, who are going to follow after them and start to revolutionize our conceptions of the universe as well. So then we have Sir Isaac Newton, of course, giving us Principia Mathematica, and in his 3 books, he defined the universe using mathematical principles. Those were big changes. Another change that we saw in the revolution of human thought, we saw new conceptions of both human and animal development, initially with animal development, with survival of the fittest. And that author, of course, is Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, in his Origin of the Species, first told us, that organisms are going to compete, organisms are going to fight to survive, and those that are meant to survive will. Eventually, in the book The Descent of Man, he will also indicate that humans are essentially the same thing, same kind of organisms that are, some are meant to survive, some are not. He will also apply some racial issues to that, which the Nazis will later use in their definitions of what makes Aryans better. All right, so a little inadvertent consequence there for Darwin. And then in terms of the mind, revolutions of thought in the mind, we have Dr. Sigmund Freud. So, Siggy Freud, interesting character. He is the first psychologist well, I guess you could say first modern psychologist in world history, first psychoanalyst, first guy to really take the brain as, by itself, not the human body with the brain, but just the brain, and look at how that impacts human behavior. And so, he is going to revolutionize our thoughts of the mind big time, which is going to bring in a lot of that uncertainty from before. Because, before, if I was a 19th century Victorian, I figured I had it all under wraps. I figured my brain was one, muscle inside my skull that I controlled every little orifice of, except for those little, clicks that make, make my back itch or something like that. But I control everything. I control everything in my mind, right? No, not according to Freud. I only control 1/9 of my mind. Only 1/9 of my brain is conscious. The rest, so therefore it is subordinate to what the rest of the brain does. So this is going to be shocking to many Europeans at this time. The way that he developed his thoughts was first, Sigmund Freud began by studying shell-shocked soldiers after the war. Try saying that fast 3 times. Shell-shocked soldiers. I can't do it. But anyway, he studied shell-shocked soldiers and found that, the brain has a very powerful effect on what the body does and what words come out of our mouth and, how we operate in society. And so he looked at it and he analyzed it as such. He's got 3 main sections of the brain. First, he's got the ego. The ego, if you take a look at the picture there, is in the conscious level for the most part. There is also some preconscious level as well. The conscious level are your thoughts, your perceptions, I'm looking across the room and I see a book and I figure, oh yeah, that is a book. Okay, that is my conscious thought in my ego. But then I also have stored knowledge. So for instance, I look at my book across the room and I remember, oh yes, that is the book by so-and-so. And I remember on page whatever, I read about something or other, right? That's stored knowledge. Then also in my ego, in my preconscious area, a little bit below the surface, are my fears. My fears that creep in there once in a while, like, I'm terrified of spiders, right? My worst fear is probably a spider crawling into my mouth when I'm sleeping. That's, yeah, so you know what I'm talking about. All right, and then memories, those just pop up once in a while. I see someone walking down the street and suddenly I'm reminded, oh, that looks like so-and-so, and then that name pops back into my head. That was in the preconscious level, in my ego, right? Or I'm playing Jeopardy, and oh, my stored knowledge jumped out of my preconscious into my conscious, and my ego told me the answer is Alex Trebek used to have a really awesome mustache, but he doesn't anymore, right? Okay, so that's your ego. Then the rest is going to be your subconscious. This is the dominant part of your brain. So the biggest part of this for Freud is the id, what's called the id. This is your primitive side. This is the vicious side, the animalistic, atavistic, gratification-seeking side, where it can be incredibly destructive. It's also incredibly irrational. These are your selfish needs, your violent motives, your immoral urges, your unacceptable sexual desires, your irrational wishes, and your shameful experiences, like that one time in 3rd grade. Oh, yeah, so, those kinds of things are your innate drives. Now, as a baby, I'm going to be born with a much stronger id, right, than anything else, because things like my ego have not really fully developed, and things like my superego have not really fully developed, right? So I'll just, define that while I'm sitting on it. So the superego is the composite of what's out there. These are the moral rules that are intrinsic in your brain because society and your upbringing has kind of pushed those into you. Right, so your individual moral code. Some of it's religious, some of it's non-religious. So basically, your superego, your morals, and your id are constantly at battle with one another. A healthy mind has got an ego that can act as an effective referee between those two and control it, right? But it doesn't start that way. I mean, when we start, we're all babies, right? And when we come flying out of the womb, we don't come out and, in a very civilized fashion, turn to the doctor and say, "Hey, doctor, great delivery. Let's get a diaper on this thing." Right? That's not how it went for me anyway. At least, I don't think it did. And so, there's this irrational side where I come out of the womb and I go, "Oh, man, it's really bright in here!" And, without putting it into words. But yeah, you get the point. And then when I'm hungry as a baby, I don't turn to my mother and say, "Mother, I'm hungry. Feed me." No. Instead, I'm going to go, be screaming like crazy, and Mom hopefully will figure that A, my diaper needs changing, or B, I need to eat. So that's my id. It's my primitive. It's all about me, gratification side, right? Okay. Another part is, as I get older, hopefully, again, the superego and the ego will form in a way that will keep me from letting my id get out of control. If it doesn't, I'm starting to have some issues, right? So let's say that I'm an incredibly irrational person as an adult, and when someone takes my lunch or asks for a cookie from my lunch, how about that? When someone asks for a cookie from my lunch, I could be let my ego take over and say, "Oh yes, I would be glad to give you a cookie. I'm a good person." Or my animalistic side could say, "Oh, I'm hungry," and then I could punch you in the face, and then I could rip out your larynx or something crazy, right? That's your id. That's scary. Okay, so essentially, Freud's telling us, the mind is an interesting and tricky place. So a little bit more detail on that. His id. The id is where Freud spent most of his time because he, it's the weirdest zone, so he must have enjoyed it a bit more, I guess. So one thing that he talks about is the libido. The libido is your psychic energy. Now, when he says psychic energy, he says that it is primarily sexual. So the psychic energy is driven by intrinsic sexual desires, which dominate. Right? Now, he said that these can take two different forms. You can you can suppress that, you can repress it, and then it turns into something destructive. It gets displaced or sublimated into something destructive potentially, and it channels those energies into something that could be bad. So, for instance, Freud said that World War I was the result of an entire generation of Victorian men who had repressed their libido, and they therefore sublimated that negative, destructive libido psychic energy into creating the largest war in history. Not sure I agree with it, but you can see where he's going with it maybe. Another thing you can do is do displacement, meaning that you channel it into something that's more positive. So for instance, an artist is a really good artist because they displace their libido and they sublimate it into their art and therefore create beautiful art. All right, another one that he talks about is that if you repress the id too much, those desires will lead to neuroses, an imbalance in which you start to go a little mental. Right? And so for him, the reason that people go crazy or have issues or anything like that is often because of the repression of their id's innate desires, often dealing with sexual energy. Another one that he talked about was the Oedipus and Electra complexes. So the Oedipus complex refers to males, young boys who have a love for their mothers. That is an incredibly strong attachment. It's normal, right? Electra complex, same thing, but for girls regarding their fathers. So I don't know how many of you remember when you were little kids. Maybe when you were a little kid, maybe if you were a boy, you sometimes felt jealous of your father. Strange, I know. But or maybe you when you were a little kid, asked your mom to marry you. Or girls, you might have asked your dad to marry you. And then your dad's like, well, I can't marry you, honey. I'm married to your mother. And you're like, and then eventually you grow up and you're like, wow, that was weird. Let's not do that again. Dad, I didn't mean that, right? So ideally, you're going to grow out of that phase, and someday you will not want to do that, right? But those that are neurotic will not outgrow that, and that's the interesting thing. That's what causes crazy. All right, so Another one that Freud talks about is how childhood experiences are often very crucial to how an adult forms. So an adult mental balance is formed in childhood, and sometimes, let's say you've got a really terrible father who just beats the crap out of you. I mean, that kind of experience can have a traumatic effect upon both your ego and your id. Right? Another thing, though, too, is let's say, you pee your pants in school one day and everybody makes fun of you. From that point forward, you might wet your bed for the rest of your life, even when you're an adult, because you've got this, this psychic energy inside you that causes that, and you can't control it. The only way to control it is to treat it. Treat the neuroses and the repressions. The best way to do it is to do a little thing called psychoanalysis. So Freud developed this process where you have psychoanalysis, meaning that you have free association. Let's say... excuse me, let's say I'm a bedwetter, right? So if I'm a bedwetter, Freud would lay me on one of his fainting couches. You guys remember the fainting couches from Victorian era? Kind of cool, right? Half couch. So Freud would lay me on one of his fainting couches. I would stare up at the ceiling, and I would talk about various events in my childhood. And maybe I would meander my way over to the thought of the time when I peed in front of my class. And I don't want to talk about it, but I'm going to get it out there. And as soon as I get it out there, maybe, the psychoanalyst, who is my doctor, can help me realize that's what makes me wet my bed. Right? Another thing they'll do is do dream analysis. So, for instance, if you show up to school naked in your dreams and everybody laughs at you, or show up to school in your underwear, that means that you are feeling unprepared for something, or you're nervous about something. Right? It's weird, but I often have dreams, like the week before school starts, I always have these dreams that I show up to school and my room is a mess, well, more so than usual, and I don't have my syllabi printed. And everybody looks at me like, wow, you're the worst teacher ever. That's a weird dream. That's my psyche telling me, get your butt in gear and get your stuff printed. That's weird. But hey, that's what Freud says. So another one is Freudian slips and jokes. Sometimes, you'll be talking and all of a sudden you'll say a sexual term inadvertently. Like you're trying to talk about beasts and you'll actually accidentally say breasts. That's an indication that, that's an indication that you have repressed your libido and therefore, it's slipping out and just kind of making a funny. And it's kind of funny, yeah. So there are some dangers, though, with psychoanalysis. One is you got to have a doctor that actually knows what they're doing. I mean, if you were having a bad day and having bad dreams, I wouldn't lay you on a fainting couch and say, okay, tell me your problems. And then I would sit there and, pretend to listen while I'm actually, thinking about my lunch menu. And then, have you release this inner beast and then have it turn against us somehow. The point being, you got to have someone who knows what they're doing in order to interpret these symbols and things. Another thing is you got to avoid transference because, if I'm the person laying on the couch and I'm talking about how I never got over my Oedipus complex and suddenly, my doctor is looking like, a super hot doctor, female doctor, mind you, then, I could transfer those feelings onto her and then, I'm doubly neurotic. That would be bad. That would be really bad. So the doctor needs to know when transference is happening. That way they can prevent it. All right. So some criticism. Freud obviously has a lot of critics. One of them is that many people are starting to argue that the id is not a dominantly sexual instinct. There's more to it than that. That it could be things like, for instance, an inferiority complex. So, for instance, a Freudian by the name of Alfred Adler said that it's more than sex that drives human behavior. It's also man's desire to prove his superiority. He said that was the mainspring of all human behavior, that all men, try to achieve. And if they don't try to achieve, if they have an inferiority complex, they're not go-getters and they feel bashful or shy or whatever, or they're a bedwetter, that's because, not because of a sexual issue, but because, of something that maybe happened in their past that's making them feel like they can't do any better. Then we also have extroverts and introverts. Carl Jung, another Freudian, said that he minimized the role of sex in the id and said that the human personality and their development is actually due more to hereditary factors. Like if my dad is real outgoing but my mother is shy, maybe I'm going to get one of their traits or maybe a mix of both and I'll have a little bit of both, or if both parents are really shy, I might be really shy too. Or it could be the arch opposite of both my parents for some reason. Another one is, again, people are starting to question the influence of not only sex, but also childhood on the id, whether or not it's just childhood that impacts the id and controls some of those things. And then questions psychoanalysis as a treatment. You know, just talking it out may not always be the best method. So that's Freud. Essentially, he is challenging previous thought. He is putting people on edge a little bit. Wow, I don't control my mind anymore. It's an age of anxiety. It's a strange time period. It's an epoch of confusion. All right, we see that through art, too. Artistic movements of the 1920s are going to get interesting. We've seen some of these before and some of the terms before, but we'll just quickly run through them as they're applicable to the time period, such as the Fauves. The Fauves, or the Wild Beasts, remember they were a French movement primarily led by a guy named Henri Matisse, as much as an artist can lead a movement. Henri Matisse was one of the masters behind this Fauve movement. And he gives us ones like this, you know, definitely a different spin on a self-portrait, or excuse me, on an individual portraiture, very different from what we saw in the Renaissance. We also see ones like this, you know, this is a cool everyday scene of, you know, some boats on what appears to be a lake or on the ocean, some sailboats, maybe on a river, I don't know, but it's a cool interpretation. It's kind of taking impressionism and combining it with something more abstract, you know, something different. All right, and then we have guys like Durrell, who gives us this, again, very different kind of portraiture, in this case of a prostitute. And, you know, it's just, yeah, I don't really know what I can say about that one. Different, cool, interesting. Then we have Cubism, right? Cubism, of course, the leader of Cubism was Picasso. And so here, this, I got to say, this is a pretty legit way to do a portraiture. This is self-portrait. Remember Picasso, he did all kinds of cool things. Remember Cubism, essentially the idea was you're taking, it's kind of like taking a vase and smashing it on the floor and taking the various pieces and putting them together on a canvas. That's very similar to Cubism. We also have, you know, our analogy that we made before where people are like, oh, I hate modern art, I hate abstract art. You know, there's something that's just innately beautiful about abstract art, and Cubism in particular, I think, because, you know, it's up to individual interpretation. You know, it's like modern dubstep music. It's weird, it's jarring, it almost hurts the eardrums, and yet at the same time, it's oddly beautiful. You know, same thing with modern art. Then we have Dada. You remember Dadaism, the French movement of the 20th century, where they decided to tear up a page in the dictionary, threw it on the ground, and it's spelled Dada. And they said, well, hey, that is the new name of our artistic movement. And so we have, for instance, art by this man. I think I told you about this last year in U.S. history. We have a guy by the name of Marcel Duchamp who gave us The Fountain. Now, The Fountain, remember he received this urinal that he turned upside down as a gift in 1915, and then in 1917 he signed a pseudonym to it, and he submitted it to an art institute, and they immediately refused it and said it was crap. Get it? Well, maybe they said it was piss. Oh, I cracked myself up. Sorry. And so then he decided, all right, well, hey, I'm going to submit it somewhere else. And they took it, and they loved it, and they bought it. And then we don't have the original anymore, but they made a few replicas. And the most recent replica that was sold in 1999 went for $1.5 million. Huh. So that's modern art. A replica of a urinal. All right, but then we also have this one. I don't know if you can see what's going on, but on the right-hand side, we have a cityscape, a city scene. On the left, we have some more city buildings in the front left, in the foreground. The blue line in the background to the left is actually a bridge, and then the gold flowing below it is a river. Check that out, huh? That is a city scene, a new scene of cityscape. Kind of cool for the Dadaists. Then we have this one. This is weird. That we have, you know, modern anatomical conceptions to the left. We have a man not facing the viewer, but instead looking at a romantic picture by Eugene Delacroix of the Massacre at Chios. And we have a typewriter, an apple, a desk, shag carpet, and a go-go dancer from the Moulin Rouge, scantily clad. Huh. That's art. Then we got Lobster Man, who is dressed in tin. And composing some beautiful tin lobster orchestral music. That's exciting. That's Dada. And then we have the newspaper dress, where they took newspaper clippings, turned it into a dress, and voila, French art. All right, then we have this one. This one's kind of cool. This one is a jazz scene. I don't know if you can tell, but in the background we've got people sitting at tables, and it appears in the back left that might be the jazz band. Then in the foreground we have various people dancing in couples, and then surrounding them on the right and the foreground in the bottom, we have them sitting at tables, and the dance floor is in the middle. How cool is that? Using kind of a combination of Cubism and Dadaism, yeah. All right, then we have Surrealism. This is where it's kind of getting crazy. This is Salvador Dali. He's doing the Temptation of St. Anthony. Now, I don't know if you remember the previous Temptation of St. Anthony that we saw by Grunewald, from the Renaissance, where he had St. Anthony being torn apart by demons and weird morphodytic, frog-like creatures. But here we have St. Anthony in the nude, holding up a cross to fend off the lust temptations that he's having, and the temptations for power and glory that he's having, and he's pushing them back. And how cool is that? I mean, you've got all of his temptations right there, and he's fending them off with the cross. That's kind of cool. Then we've got the Floating Rose. This is a famous one. Just beautiful. Downright beautiful. In a desert, in the sky. Awesome. Then we have Weird Face Stretchy Man. I don't remember what this one is called, but dang it, I just love Salvador Dali. I mean, this is a guy that's got some seriously weird art, but man, is it cool. Like the cloud heads here and the tree head as they are progressing through the valleys. Salvador Dali, he would wake up every morning, and he had a book next to his bed, or excuse me, a diary next to his bed, where he would write down his dreams. And so he would write down, the weird things from his dreams that his psyche had released to him from his id, if you will, and then turn that into paint on canvas. Truly beautiful, like Bubble Woman here. Pretty awesome. All right. And then in literature, we see this same kind of weird trend happening through modernism. With Kafka, you might have read this in English, but we have Metamorphosis, where a man wakes up as a cockroach and then has to try and live his life as a cockroach. So that's a fun one. You got to read it. It's a fun short story. Then we have from James Joyce, we have Ulysses. So Ulysses is truly strange. This is what's called stream of consciousness writing, where essentially what the author is trying to do is using this modern concept of writing every single thought, every thought that is in the character's brain at that moment, and putting it on paper. So here's an example. I'll just read for you a section from James Joyce's Ulysses. So, by the way, Ulysses, as I'm getting started with this, Ulysses is the Roman name of Odysseus, and you might recall that Odysseus had quite the journey that lasted, well, really 20 years. First 10 years was going from Ithaca to Troy, fighting in the Trojan War, and then the next 10 years was his journey back from Troy back to Ithaca to conquer his, get back home and make sure that he got his wife back, as all these other suitors were trying to take her away from him, and then take his kingdom. And so Joyce's Ulysses gives us a cool look into one day in the life of one man in Dublin and all of the various journeys that he has. So here's part of that day. Poor Mrs. Purfoy, Methodist husband in his madness, saffron, bun, and milk and soda, lunch in the educational dairy, eating with a stopwatch, 32 chews to a minute, still has mutton chop, whiskers grew, supposed to be well connected, Theodore's cousin in Dublin Castle, one Tony relative in every family, hearty annuals he presents her with, saw him out at the three Jolly Toppers marching along bareheaded and his eldest boy carrying one in a market net. The squallors, poor thing, then having to give the breast year after year, all hours of the night, selfish those TTs are, dog and the manager, only one lump of sugar in my tea, if you please. He stood at Fleet Street crossing, luncheon interval at 6 penny at Rose. Must look up that ad in the National Library. An 8 penny in the Burton. Better, on my way. He walked on past Bolton's, Westermole House. T. I forgot to tap Tom Kernan. And then just goes on. It even describes one scene where he's actually defecating. Have fun reading that one. All right, so James Joyce's Ulysses, strange. And it goes on like that for about, I think it was like 500-600 pages, 700 pages, about the size of the New Testament. It's huge, like that. Have fun. All right, and then Faulkner is the American version of this stream of consciousness writing. Wrote a couple of books, very brilliant books, one of which is As I Lay Dying, the other one, The Sound and the Fury. I don't want to ruin these for you, but we get the shortest chapter in literature history, which is, I can't remember which character says it, but in one chapter, the whole thing is where one of the characters, I think it's Vardaman, says, "My mother is a fish." End chapter. Oh, so you're going to have to read it to understand what he's talking about. And even then, good luck. But then The Sound and the Fury is another excellent one. I don't want to ruin any endings for you, but it's brilliant, and you should read it. All right, so that concludes for today. See you next time.